Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a topic that you clearly care a lot about, the state of women's rights around the world.
Definitely an important one.
Yeah, you've sent in so many different sources. I mean, articles, reports, even some personal stories. So
Yeah, it's a wide race.
it really is.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to go beyond just the headlines,
Mhm.
and really look at the realities of oppression that women face in some parts of the world, but also those kind of like subtle inequalities that exist even in countries that are known for being progressive.
Yeah.
Those kind of hidden things.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see how those inequalities differ across cultures. And one thing that really stood out from all the material, especially one of those AI sources, was how many restrictions on women are like deeply rooted in cultural and religious norms.
It makes you realize it's way more complex than
Well,
just changing laws, right?
Exactly. It's so deeply embedded.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start with some of those more extreme examples. You actually sent in a list of 20 countries where women are facing like really severe restrictions. So like Afghanistan, for instance, has really seen a dramatic rollback of women's rights. I mean, no school for girls past elementary school, enforced burqas, severely limited access to health care. It's like going back in time. What are the wider implications of this kind of control, stepping back a little bit?
Well, it really shows how quickly progress can be undone. The Taliban's whole ideology is about controlling women, like their visibility, their presence in public life. By restricting access to education and, enforcing these strict dress codes, they're basically trying to limit women's influence in society. And the consequences for women who don't follow these rules are really severe. It's like a warning to anyone who might even think about resisting.
It's scary to think about what women in Afghanistan are going through. And then there's places like Saudi Arabia where they have that male guardianship system, which basically treats women like they're always children needing permission for everything, travel, marriage,
Yeah.
even medical care. Is this a common thing in these restrictive systems, this kind of thinking?
Oh, absolutely. The male guardianship system that you see in a few different countries is like a textbook example of patriarchal control.
Right.
It reinforces that idea that women aren't capable or responsible enough to make their own decisions and need a man to oversee everything. It takes away their freedom and just keeps that power imbalance between men and women in place.
You highlighted Yemen as another country with some really disturbing practices. Child marriage is still a huge problem there, with girls as young as 9 being forced to marry. I mean, it's just unimaginable what that does to a child. What are the long-term consequences of something like that, both for those girls and for Yemen as a whole?
Child marriage is a total violation of human rights. It steals their childhood, their education, their health. They're often forced into pregnancy and childbirth way too young, which is incredibly damaging to their physical and mental health. It also traps them in poverty and limits their future. It's like a chain reaction that holds back the whole country.
It's just heartbreaking that this is still happening.
Yeah.
And these are just a few examples from a long list. We see similar things in Sudan, where women are punished for wearing clothes considered indecent, like trousers or short sleeves. It seems so random. What's the real message behind laws like that?
It's all about controlling women's bodies and behavior. They use modesty as an excuse, but it's really about saying that women are responsible for men's actions and have to dress in a certain way to avoid unwanted attention. The burden's always on women to prevent harassment or assault instead of addressing the root of the problem.
It's such a double standard. And then there's Nepal, where they still practice something called chowpatty in some areas. They banish women to separate huts when they're menstruating, exposing them to danger and disease. It's like something out of the Middle Ages. And it's been outlawed, but it still happens. Why is it so hard to get rid of these harmful traditions?
Chowpatty is a perfect example of how cultural beliefs can put women's lives at risk. The taboo around menstruation, this idea that women are impure during their period, is what fuels this practice. To get rid of something like this, you need a whole system change. Education awareness campaigns, legal enforcement, and giving women the power to challenge these norms within their own communities.
It's a huge undertaking for sure,
Definitely.
but essential.
Absolutely. So we've seen some pretty shocking examples of oppression. But it's not just about those really extreme cases, right? There are these more subtle forms of inequality that exist even in countries that consider themselves to be pretty progressive in terms of women's rights. So how do these inequalities manifest in those settings where on the surface things seem to be better? That's a great point. You can have laws and policies in place that promote gender equality, but that doesn't mean those inequalities disappear in everyday life. In fact, they often become even more difficult to see and address.
Because they're not as in your face, right?
Exactly. And you brought up Sweden as an example. A country often praised for its commitment to gender equality. But even there you see significant disparities.
Yeah, that's what was so fascinating to me. Like, I always think of Sweden as being so advanced in this area, but then you look at the numbers and it's like, wait a minute, there's still a big gap.
Yeah, for sure. For example, the gender pay gap is still a real issue there. Women earn, on average, less than men, and the difference is not insignificant.
Yeah, the source material, there were some numbers from 2022, I think. It was like women were earning around 36,200 Swedish krona, while men were making closer to 40,200.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about salaries, it affects their pensions too. Women in Sweden receive something like 30% lower pensions on average than men, which is a huge deal, especially as they get older.
It's like this long-term impact that you don't always see right away.
Right.
And it's not just about the money either, right? It's about these less tangible things like power dynamics and opportunities.
You got it. You see this thing called job segregation, where women are concentrated in certain fields like healthcare or education, while men dominate higher paying sectors like finance or tech. And then there's the whole issue of unpaid labor. Women still shoulder most of the burden of housework and caregiving, which affects their career prospects and earning potential.
It's like this invisible workload that doesn't get recognized,
Right.
but it has a huge impact. And what about leadership positions? Are women equally represented in those roles in Sweden?
Unfortunately, not really. Women are still underrepresented in leadership positions across the board, even in a country like Sweden. You see this in business politics, you name it. In fact, only about 25% of CEOs in Sweden are women. So there's still a long way to go in terms of breaking that glass ceiling.
So even in a country that's considered a model for gender equality, we're still seeing these persistent inequalities. And you mentioned violence against women earlier. Is that a problem in Sweden too?
Sadly, it is. Domestic violence and sexual assault are unfortunately still very real issues in Sweden. It might not make the same kind of headlines as in some other parts of the world, but it's a serious problem that needs to be addressed. It's a reminder that even in countries that are making progress in many areas, there's still work to be done to ensure women's safety and security.
It's a sobering thought that even in places that seem to be doing well on the surface, these issues still persist. And it makes you wonder what's going on beneath the surface. Like what are the underlying factors that contribute to these inequalities, even when you have laws and policies in place that are supposed to promote equality?
Sure. Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a complex issue with a lot of contributing factors. But I think a big part of it is that changing laws and policies is just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
You can have all the right laws in place, but if you don't address those deeper societal norms and attitudes, those inequalities are going to keep popping up in different ways. It's like trying to fix a leaky roof without actually fixing the foundation.
Yeah, it makes sense. So we have to look at those cultural attitudes and beliefs and really unpack where they're coming from. And how do we even begin to change those deeply ingrained ways of thinking?
Well, that's where things get really tricky. It's not a quick fix. It takes time, education awareness, and a lot of uncomfortable conversations. But one thing that's crucial is challenging those gender stereotypes that we're all exposed to from a young age. The ones that tell girls they should be quiet and submissive and boys should be strong and dominant. These stereotypes limit everyone's potential and create this breeding ground for inequality.
And it's everywhere, right? In the media, in our families, in our education systems. It's like this constant bombardment of messages about what it means to be a man or a woman.
Yeah.
And those messages shape how we see the world and how we treat each other.
Exactly. So we need to be more critical of those messages and start questioning where they come from and who they benefit. We need to start telling different stories, stories that celebrate diversity and challenge those rigid gender roles. And we need to show boys and girls that they can be anything they want to be, that they don't have to conform to these narrow expectations.
It's about expanding those possibilities for everyone, right?
Absolutely. It's about creating a world where everyone has the chance to thrive, regardless of their gender.
I love that. So we've talked about those really shocking examples of oppression and those more subtle but still significant inequalities that exist even in progressive countries. It seems like violence against women is a common thread that runs through all of this. And that's a topic that really needs its own deep dive because it's so pervasive and affects women in every corner of the world.
It really does. It's a global epidemic that we can't ignore. And it's deeply connected to all the issues we've been talking about, those power imbalances, those gender stereotypes, those harmful cultural norms. Violence against women is both a consequence and a cause of gender inequality. It's this vicious cycle that we need to break.
And that's what we're going to be tackling in our next deep dive. So stay tuned for that. But before we wrap up this part, I just want to say how much I appreciate you bringing all this information to our attention. It's so important to keep these issues at the forefront of our minds and to keep having these conversations even when they're uncomfortable.
I agree. We can't just turn a blind eye to what's happening. We have to keep talking about it, keep learning about it, and keep working towards a better future for all women.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So until next time, keep diving deep.
And stay curious.
These examples are really eye-opening. It shows the huge range of challenges that women face all over the world.
Yeah.
But it's not just about laws and cultural practices, right? We need to talk about violence against women.
Yeah.
This isn't just those shocking stories you hear sometimes. It affects women everywhere.
Yeah, it's a global problem. The World Health Organization thinks that 1 in 3 women experience some kind of violence in their lifetime.
That's a scary thought. And it makes you wonder, what are the root causes of this violence? We talked about patriarchy earlier. But how does that actually lead to harm?
Well, at its heart, patriarchy is all about power and control. It's the idea that men are better than women and should have power over them. This creates an environment where violence can thrive. It can be seen in limiting women's choices, justifying aggression in relationships, lots of ways.
Earlier, we talked about the UAE, where women who report rape can actually be charged with adultery. It seems like the system completely fails to protect them. Is that common? Are legal systems often not set up to deal with violence against women?
It's sad, but yes. In many countries, laws about rape, domestic violence, and sexual harassment are weak or not enforced. This tells people that violence against women is okay. It creates a situation where the people who commit these acts don't face consequences.
It's like a double injustice. First with violence itself, then no justice afterwards.
Yeah.
We also talked about Pakistan, where honor killings are still happening. The idea that a family could murder a woman because they think she damaged their reputation is just horrifying. What could lead to this level of violence?
Honor killings are a terrifying example of how patriarchal control can become deadly. The belief that a woman's actions, especially her sexuality, reflect on her family's honor is really strong in some cultures. This leads to a situation where women's lives are not valued and their basic human rights are ignored.
It's like they're seen as objects, not people with their own choices.
Yeah.
And we see this kind of thinking in less extreme ways, too, like the way women's clothing is constantly scrutinized in many cultures.
Right. The focus on bodice dress for women often comes from the idea that they're responsible for how men behave and have to avoid provoking them. This puts the blame on women to prevent harassment or assault, like men can't control themselves.
That's the classic blaming the victim. We saw it in Sudan, where women can be punished for wearing trousers or short sleeves. It's as if their bodies are seen as tempting, and it's their job to manage that. It's ridiculous.
It's a dangerous way of thinking that we have to challenge. Blaming women for men's actions lets this violence continue. We need to address the real causes, toxic masculinity, power imbalances, and the acceptance of violence against women.
It seems like a huge task, changing these beliefs and power structures that have been around for centuries. How do we even begin to dismantle this?
It takes a multi-pronged approach. We need legal reforms to hold perpetrators accountable and protect survivors. Education is key for both men and women to challenge stereotypes and promote respectful relationships. We also need to create a culture where women feel safe to speak out against violence and seek justice without fear of shame or retaliation.
It's clear that violence against women is tied to those power imbalances we keep coming back to. And this brings us to another important aspect of women's rights, reproductive rights.
Yeah, reproductive rights are so central to the fight for equality. It's about women having control over their own bodies, their fertility, their futures. And as you said, it's all connected to these bigger issues of power and control.
It feels like this is where things get really personal and political. It's not just about individual choices, but about women's role in society as a whole. What happens to society when women are denied control over their reproductive lives?
When women can't make decisions about their reproductive health, it affects everything. Access to contraception and safe abortion allows women to get an education, work, and contribute to their communities in their own way. When you deny them those rights, it limits their opportunities and keeps them stuck in poverty and dependence.
So it's not just about individual freedom, it's about economic empowerment and social progress too. But we're seeing so many challenges to reproductive rights, even in countries that think of themselves as progressive on other women's rights issues. What are some of the global trends we're seeing?
It's a mixed bag, unfortunately. There's been progress in some areas, but we're also seeing a worrying pushback against reproductive rights, especially access to safe and legal abortion. This is happening all over the world, even in places like the United States, where overturning Roe v. Wade has had a huge impact on women's access to health care.
It shows that progress isn't always a straight line. Rights that we thought were secure can be taken away, and we can't take anything for granted. What are some of the arguments used to justify restricting reproductive rights? It often seems like it's more about control than anything else.
You're right. It often comes down to control. The arguments often focus on religious beliefs, cultural norms, or the sanctity of life. But what they often ignore is the real impact on women's lives when they're denied these basic rights. For example, restricting access to safe abortion doesn't stop abortion, it just makes it unsafe and puts women's lives at risk.
That's messed up.
Huh.
By denying women access to safe procedures, you end up putting their lives in more danger. And when women are forced to carry unwanted pregnancies, it has a ripple effect, keeping them in poverty and limiting their choices.
Exactly. It's a form of control that impacts their whole lives. And we need to remember that this isn't just a theoretical debate, it's about real women facing real consequences every day.
So what can we do to make sure that all women have access to all the reproductive health care services they need? It feels like we're at a turning point.
It needs a multifaceted approach. We need strong laws that protect reproductive rights, comprehensive sex education that empowers young people to make informed choices, and accessible, affordable healthcare services that meet women's different needs.
And, of course, we need to keep advocating and fighting. We can't become complacent. We need to keep pushing back against attempts to restrict women's rights and make sure their voices are heard.
Definitely. This is an ongoing struggle, and it takes all of us working together. We need individuals, organizations, and governments to create a world where women have full control over their bodies and their reproductive choices.
This deep dive has been a real journey, inspiring, infuriating, and ultimately a call to action. We've gone from blatant oppression in some parts of the world to the more subtle but just as harmful inequalities that exist everywhere.
You put it perfectly. The fight for women's rights is a fight for human rights. It needs us to be constantly vigilant, to keep advocating, and to be willing to challenge the status quo.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. It's clear from all the sources you sent in that this is an issue you really care about. And I hope this deep dive has given you even more to think about and maybe even act on.
I hope so too. Remember, even small actions can make a difference. Let's all work towards a world where women everywhere can live with dignity, freedom, and equality.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
See you then.